Hello. This is Morel with Stories for Kids. Hello, Birdie. Where's the bell today, Birdie? Birdie says, I don't know, Morel, what you've done with the bell. I know, I put it down somewhere and I can't find it at the moment. But anyway, I have a story for you. And the story is The Ice Dragon. This story will be in 2 parts. It's a long story, so I've broken it down into 2 parts. So, I hope that you are sitting comfortably. Yeah. And I will begin the story of The Ice Dragon. Now, this is the tale of the wonders that befell on the evening of the 11th of December, when they did what they were told not to do. You may think that you know all the unpleasant things that could possibly happen to you if you are disobedient, but there are some things which even you do not know. And they did not know them either. Their names were George and Jane. There were no fireworks that year on Guy Fawkes' Day, because the heir to the throne was not well. He was cutting his first tooth, and that is a very anxious time for any person, even for a royal one. He was really very poorly, so that fireworks would have been in the worst possible taste, even at Land's End or in the Isles of Man. Whilst in Forest Hill, which was the home of Jane and George, anything of the kind was quite out of the question. Even the Crystal Palace, empty-headed as it is, felt that this was no time for Catherine Wheels. But when the prince had cut his tooth, rejoicings were not only admissible but correct. And the 11th of December was proclaimed Firework Day. All the people were most anxious to show their loyalty and to enjoy themselves at the same time. So there were fireworks and torchlight processions and set pieces at the Crystal Palace with blessings on our prince and long live our royal darling in different coloured fires. And the most private of boarding schools had a half holiday. And even the children of plumbers and authors had 2pence each given them to spend as they liked. George and Jane had 6pence each, and they spent the whole amount on a golden rain, which would not light for ever so long. And when it did light, went out almost at once. So they had to look at the fireworks in the gardens next door and at the ones at the Crystal Palace, which were very glorious indeed. All their relations had coals in their heads, so Jane and George were allowed to go out into the garden alone to let off their firework. Jane had put on her fur cape and her thick gloves and her hood with the silver fox fur on it that was made out of Mother's old muff. And George had his overcoat with the 3 capes and his comforter, and father's seal skin travelling cap with the pieces that come down over your ears. It was dark in the garden, but the fireworks all about them made it seem very gay, and though the children were cold, they were quite sure that they were enjoying themselves. They got up on the fence at the end of the garden to see better, and then they saw, very far away, where the edge of the dark world is, a shining line of straight, beautiful lights arranged in a row, as if they were the spears carried by a fairy army. "Oh, how pretty," said Jane. "I wonder what they are. It looks as if the fairies were planting little shiny baby poplar trees and watering them with liquid light." "Liquid fiddlesticks," said George. He had been to school, so he knew that these were only the Aurora Borealis, or northern lights. And he said so. "But what is the Rory Bory, what's his name?" asked Jane. "Who lights it? And what's it there for?" George had to own that he had not learned that. "But I know," said he, "that it has something to do with the Great Bear, and the Dipper, and the Plough, and Charles's Wain." "And what are they?" asked Jane. "Oh, they're the surnames of some of the star families." "There goes a jolly rocket," answered George, and Jane felt as if she almost understood about the star families. The fairy spears of light twinkled and gleamed. They were much prettier than the big, blaring, blazing bonfire that was smoking and flaming and spluttering in the next door but one garden. Prettier even than the coloured fires at the Crystal Palace. "I wish we could see them nearer," Jane said. "I wonder if the star families are nice families, the kind that Mother would like us to go to tea with, if we were little stars." "They aren't that sort of families at all, silly," said her brother, kindly trying to explain. "I only said families because a kid like you wouldn't have understood if I'd said and besides, I've forgotten the end of the word. Anyway, the stars are all up in the sky, so you can't go to tea with them." "No," said Jane. "I said if we were little stars. But we aren't," said George. "No," said Jane with a sigh. "I know that. I'm not so stupid as you think, George. But the Tory Borealis are somewhere at the edge. Couldn't we go and see them?" "Considering you're 8, you haven't much sense." George kicked his boots against the fencing to warm his toes. "It's half the world away." "Well, it looks very near," said Jane, hunching up her shoulders to keep her neck warm. "They're close to the North Pole," said George. "Look here, I don't care a straw about the Aurora Borealis, but I shouldn't mind discovering the North Pole. It's awfully difficult and dangerous. And then you come home and write a book about it with a lot of pictures, and everybody says how brave you are. Jane got off the fence. "Oh, George, let's, she said. "We shall never have such a chance again, all alone by ourselves, and quite late, too." "I'd go right enough if it wasn't for you," George answered gloomily. "But you know, they always say I lead you into mischief, and if we went to the North Pole, we should get our boots wet, as likely as not. And you remember what they said about not going on the grass?" "They said the lawn," said Jane. "We're not going on the lawn." "Oh, George, do let's. It doesn't look so very far. We could be back before they had time to get dreadfully angry." "All right," said George. "But mind, I don't want to go." So off they went. They got over the fence, which was very cold and white and shiny because it was beginning to freeze. And on the other side of the fence was somebody else's garden. So they got out of that as quickly as they could. And beyond that was a field where there was another big bonfire, with people standing around it who looked quite dark-skinned. "It's like Indians," said George, and wanted to stop and look. But Jane pulled him on, and they passed by the bonfire and got through a gap in the hedge into another field, a dark one, and far away, beyond quite a number of other dark fields. The northern lights shone and sparkled and twinkled. Now, during the winter, the Arctic regions come much farther south than they are marked on the map. Very few people know this, though you would think they could tell it by the ice in the jugs of a morning. And just then, when George and Jane were starting for the North Pole, the Arctic regions had come down very nearly as far as Forest Hill, so that as the children walked on, it grew colder and colder, and presently they saw that the fields were covered with snow, and there were great icicles hanging from all the hedges and gates, and the northern lights still seemed some way off. They were crossing a very rough, snowy field when Jane first noticed the animals. There were white rabbits and white hares and all sorts and sizes of white birds, and some larger creatures in the shadows of the hedges that Jane was unsure whether they were wolves or bears. "Polar bears. And Arctic wolves, of course, I mean," she said, for she did not want George to think her stupid again. There was a great hedge at the end of this field, all covered with snow and icicles. But the children found a place where there was a hole, and as no bears or wolves seemed to be just in that part of the hedge, they crept through and scrambled out of the frozen ditch on the other side. And then they stood still and held their breath with wonder. For in front of them, running straight and smooth right away to the northern lights, lay a great wide road of pure dark ice. And on each side were tall trees, all sparkling with white frost. And from the boughs of the trees hung strings of stars, threaded on fine moonbeams, and shining so brightly that it was like a beautiful fairy daylight. Jane said so, but George said it was like the electric lights at the Earl's Court exhibition. The rows of trees went as straight as ruled lines away, away and away. And at the other end of them shone the Aurora Borealis. There was a signpost of silvery snow, and on it, in letters of pure ice, the children read, "This way to the North Pole." Then George said, "Way or no way, I know a slide when I see one, so here goes." And he took a run on the frozen snow. And Jane took a run when she saw him do it, and the next moment they were sliding away, each with feet half a yard apart, along the great slide that leads to the North Pole. This great slide is made for the convenience of the polar bears, who during the winter months get their food from the army and navy stores, and it is the most perfect slide in the world. If you have never come across it, it is because you have never let off fireworks on the 11th of December and have never been thoroughly naughty and disobedient. But do not be these things in the hope of finding the great slide, because you might find something quite different, and then you will be sorry. The great slide is like common slides in that when once you have started, you have to go on to the end, unless you fall down. And then it hurts just as much the smaller kind on ponds. The great slide runs downhill all the way, so that you keep on going faster and faster and faster. George and Jane went so fast that they had not time to notice the scenery. They only saw the long lines of frosted trees and the starry lamps, and on each side, rushing back as they slid on, a very broad white world and a very large black night. And overhead, as well as in the trees, the stars were bright like silver lamps, and far ahead shone and trembled and sparkled the line of fairy spears. Jane said that, and George said, "I can see the northern lights quite plain." It is very pleasant to slide and slide and slide on clear, dark ice, especially if you feel you are really going somewhere, and more especially if that somewhere is the North Pole. The children's feet made no noise on the ice, and they went on and on in a beautiful white silence. But suddenly, the silence was shattered, and a cry rang out over the snow, "Hey, you there! Stop!" "Tumble for your life!" cried George, and he fell down at once, because it is the only way to stop. Jane fell on top of him, and then they crawled on hands and knees to the snow at the edge of the slide. And there was a sportsman, dressed in a peaked cap and a frozen moustache, like the one you see in pictures about Ice Peter. And he had a gun in his hand. "You don't happen to have any bullets about you?" said he. "No," George said truthfully. "I had 5 of Father's revolver cartridges, but they were taken away the day Nurse turned out my pocket to see if I had taken the knob of the bathroom door by mistake." "Quite so," said the sportsman. "These accidents will occur. You don't carry firearms, then, I presume?" "I haven't any firearms," said George. "But I have a firework. It's only a quib one of the boys gave me, if that's any good." And he began to feel among the string and peppermints and buttons and tops and nibs and chalk and foreign postage stamps in his knickerbocker pockets. "One could but try," the sportsman replied, and he held out his hand. But Jane pulled at her brother's jacket tail and whispered, "Ask him what he wants it for." So then the sportsman had to confess that he wanted the firework to kill the white grouse with. And when they came to look, there was the white grouse himself, sitting in the snow, looking quite pale and careworn, and waiting anxiously for the matter to be decided one way or the other. George put all the things back in his pocket and said, "No, I shan't. The reason for shooting him stopped yesterday. I heard Father say so it wouldn't be fair anyhow. I'm very sorry, but I can't. So there." The sportsman said nothing, only shook his fist at Jane, and then he got on the slide and tried to go toward the Crystal Palace, which was not easy, because that way is uphill. So they left him trying and went on. Before they started, the white grouse thanked them in a few pleasant, well-chosen words, and then they took a sideways, slanting run and started off again on the great slide, and so away towards the North Pole and the twinkling, beautiful lights. The great slide went on, and the lights did not seem to come much nearer, and the white silence wrapped around them as they slid along the wide, icy path. Then once again, the silence was broken to bits by someone calling, "Hey, you there? Stop! Tumble for your life!" cried George, and tumbled as before, stopping in the only possible way. And Jane stopped on top of him, and they crawled to the edge and came suddenly on a butterfly collector who was looking for specimens with a pair of blue glasses and a blue net and a blue book with coloured plates. "Excuse me," said the collector, "but have you such a thing as a needle about you? A very long needle?" "I have a needle book," replied Jane politely, "but there aren't any needles in it now." George took them all to do the things with pieces of cork in the boy's own scientific experiment. And the young mechanic, he did not do the thing, but he did for the needles. "Curiously enough," said the collector. I too wish to use the needle in connection with cork. I have a hat pin in my hood, said Jane. I fastened the fur with it when it caught in the nail on the greenhouse door. It's very long and sharp. Would that do? One could but try, said the collector, and Jane began to feel for the pin. But George pinched her arm and whispered, Ask him what he wants it for. Then the collector had to own that he wanted the pin to stick through the great Arctic moth, a magnificent specimen, he added, which I am most anxious to preserve. And there, sure enough, in the collector's butterfly net sat the great Arctic moth, listening attentively to the conversation. Oh, I couldn't, cried Jane. And while George was explaining to the collector that they would really rather not, Jane opened the blue folds of the butterfly net and asked the moth quietly if it would please step outside for a moment, and it did. When the collector saw that the moth was free, he seemed less angry than grieved. Well, well, said he, here's a whole Arctic expedition thrown away. I shall have to go home and fit out another. And that means a lot of writing to the papers and things. You seem to be a singularly thoughtless little girl. So they went on, leaving him too, trying to go uphill towards the Crystal Palace. When the great white Arctic moth had returned thanks in a suitable speech, George and Jane took a sideways slanting run and started sliding again between the star lamps along the great slide towards the North Pole. They went faster and faster, and the lights ahead grew brighter and brighter, so that they could not keep their eyes open, but had to blink and wink as they went. And then suddenly, the great slide ended in an immense heap of snow, and George and Jane shot right into it because they could not stop themselves, and the snow was soft, so that they went in up to their very ears. Oh, do join me. Join me. I will be back with more stories for kids. Look out for the next part of the story. So, look out for the next part of the story. I will be back soon. I will be back shortly. So, I'll see you then. All right, Morel saying, oh, Birdie wants to say bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Birdie. Bye-bye, Birdie. Okay, I will be back with the next part of the story. I'll see you then. Morel saying bye for now. Bye.